He kōna e purangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
Kia ora, I'm William Ray. Welcome to Black Sheep.
Simon.
Kia ora, Simon. It's William Ray from RNZ here again. How you doing?
Yeah, good. I just changing rooms because there's better reception here in Devonport.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay, give me 30 seconds.
This is Simon Gundry. He's a director of Gillan-Gundry Concrete Construction, and I'm ringing him up because on the 1st of September 1992, he and his crew made a pretty disturbing discovery on Auckland's North Shore.
Righto, go ahead, William.
So, yeah, I mean, can you just sort of take me back to 1992? Like, what was going on that day? Like, where were you working? What was happening?
We were working in Devonport on the corner of Rata Road and Matai Road, which is down in Cheltenham.
Cheltenham's a leafy beachfront suburb full of old Victorian villas with views out towards Rangitoto Island. And, at least according to Simon Gundry, it's also a good spot for digging.
Beautiful sandy, loamy, topsoily. It was a cruisy day digging. It wasn't like hard Glenfield clay. And all of us, the four of us, Andy Cardinal, Robert Todd, Walter Gill, my business partner and myself, all hand excavating foundations. And it was for a new house where a previous house used to be. And Robert Todd dug up a few bones and then a human skull. And Robert is a Pacific Islander. I've never seen a Pacific Islander go so white so quickly. So we stopped for a little while, and then the owner, who happened to be on site at the time, told us to cover it up and don't worry about it. So that night I went home and gave a friend of mine a call. I played senior rugby with at North Shore, a guy called Ash Edwards, who was in the police force. He was very senior in the police force, and asked him what we should do. Let it remain, be covered up and work around it, or let him, and he said, no, you've got to stop work. We'll be there in the morning first thing. And in the morning, the police arrived and closed the site down for several days while they did a complete investigation of the body.
The first thing the police did was to investigate the history of the property. It didn't take them long to find what they were looking for. Back in the 1930s, number 2 Matai Road had been linked to a series of poisonings. Police at the time had identified at least 3 victims, 2 dead, 1 living. The head of the investigation, Detective James Cummings, always suspected more had been killed. It looked like he'd been proven right.
The Nurse Kerr, they had a nursing home there in the previous history of the land, and maybe it was one of her victims.
But in 1992, detectives hit a dead end. Analysis showed the bones belonged to an elderly woman, buried about 60 years earlier. Unfortunately, police were ultimately unable to identify her or determine her cause of death. However, the discovery of these bones also unearthed some long-buried memories, including one from a woman who'd been just 9 years old at the time. The sole survivor of a serial poisoner. This is a story I first heard from crime writer Scott Bainbridge, so I've invited him on the show to share it with us. He tells the full story in his book, The Trials of Nurse Kerr.
Yeah, Elspeth Kerr, she was born in Scotland and, definitely a middle-class background. Not a lot is really known about her origins or even where she got her nursing training from. That was one of the big things that confused police when they did background checks on her as to whether she actually held a legitimate medical degree or qualification.
Scott and I have actually been working together on another podcast project for RNZ involving Elspeth Kerr. It's a true crime drama show called Inspector Cummings' Case File. But the case of Elspeth Kerr was just so weird and fascinating that I kind of felt like we needed to talk about it more. And it needed its own special episode of Black Sheep. Among the first records we have of Elspeth comes from 1906. She was 22 years old, working at a nursing home in the town of Peebles, which is south of Edinburgh, where she met 27-year-old Charles Kerr. The pair began courting and married that year. Charles was on a mission to reclaim his family legacy. A popular local newspaper his father had run before a defamation case all but bankrupted him. By all accounts, Charles did a sterling job. By the time he and Elspeth had their first child, Alexander, in 1910, the family name had been redeemed and his newspaper was thriving. All was going well for the young family until 1914. Both Charles and Elspeth served in the First World War, Elspeth nursing wounded soldiers back in Scotland, while Charles was fighting in France. He suffered from exposure to poison gas and came back a deeply changed man.
He was described as a war wreck, and I guess you'd call it PTSD today. His nerves were shot, and they decided that they would move to New Zealand. They'd heard that there were a number of other Scottish people that had made the move, and he had a cousin that lived out in New Zealand, and they were pretty much persuaded to start a new life out here.
Charles landed a job as a photographer for a local newspaper in Devonport, but he couldn't hang on to it for long. He suffered uncontrollable trembling in his left hand, which made it difficult to operate a camera. He did manage to land another job as a printer, but continued to struggle. Meanwhile, Elspeth seemed to settle into life as a housewife, raising their young son. But with her husband's condition, it quickly became clear she'd need to start looking for paid employment. In 1921, Elspeth started advertising her services as a private nurse, mostly providing care to expectant mothers and the elderly.
There were so many people in her position that had medical experience, but they didn't have that qualification. Those that were qualified would easily get a job at the Auckland Hospital or whatever hospital, but there were those with minor qualifications or just with the experience. They couldn't get proper nursing jobs. So the next best thing was for them to open up privately, and a lot of people back then, if they had the room in their own house, they would open it up to, deliver babies as well as looking after the elderly.
The strong belief is that these places were often places you could go to get an abortion.
Yes, that's right. There were a lot of places like that because obviously back then it was a family scandal and it was scandalised throughout the various towns and villages. So people would arrange to go out of town to either have an abortion or convalesce to give birth and then give that child up for adoption.
And I guess Devonport would be a good place for this, right? Because it's, these days it's as anywhere around Auckland is very heavily populated, but Devonport was still very much on the outskirts.
Yeah, it was. But, Nurse Kerr had, she knew a lot of the doctors and a lot of the medical professionals around Auckland, and she was very well respected.
In fact, in 1924, Nurse Kerr became a local hero. On the night of April 5th, a fire engine came screaming out of the Devonport station on its way to a reported house fire. The engine raced along Victoria Road, bells ringing as firemen stood on the running boards.
The fire engine, took off at speed, and the road was quite wet, and the fire engine skidded around and crashed.
One firefighter was killed, crushed on impact. 2 others were thrown across the road and badly injured.
Nurse Kerr happened to be walking home at that particular point and was the first on the scene and was able to give first aid to those injured as well as comfort the man who was dying.
Kerr leapt into action, instructing bystanders to call an ambulance and cover up the man who'd been crushed to death, while she worked to stabilise the 2 badly injured firemen. Doctors would later say neither would have survived if not for her help. A few months later, Elspeth was invited to a special dinner at the station, where she received a standing ovation from everyone present, including the mayor.
And she received a community award for her service, and it was just tragic that that call out was a hoax. That brigade member lost his life over something that, a fire that never actually happened.
1924 was also the year the Kerr family welcomed a new member.
One of the many people who made contact with Elspeth was this young girl, an unwed mother from Morrinsville in the Waikato, and she came up to stay with Nurse Kerr to give birth, and once she did, she gave birth to a little girl she called Dorothy, and Nurse Kerr became very attached to the baby, and there was a private arrangement where the Kerrs decided to informally adopt Dorothy, and they called her Betty. And the people in the community, although they kind of knew the background to it, they did accept that Betty was Nurse Kerr's foster daughter.
So now we're in the early 1930s, and things seem to be going well for Elspeth Kerr. In 1925, the Kerrs bought a beautiful 5-bedroom villa at No. 2 Matai Road, so she could take on more patients. In 1931, they moved to an even more upmarket house at 20 Queen's Parade, with a large glass conservatory where her patients could bask in the sun and look out over the harbour towards Auckland City. Betty was growing into a cheerful young girl, doted on by the whole family. Elspeth was loved by the local community, and her nursing practice was thriving. But there was one dark spot in this happy picture. Elspeth's husband, Charles.
He was mentally deteriorating quite rapidly, and although his employers were quite understanding, it got to the point where he was unreliable, just wouldn't turn up to work, and when he did, he was away with the ferries. So when the organisation let him go, he didn't really have anywhere to go to. Much later, when the people in the community were recollecting what Charles Kerr was like, they recalled him as wandering around the garden, talking to himself. He'd go to the pub and, whereas he used to be reasonably sociable, he'd just talk about the same sort of things, which is his unfortunate position. He couldn't seek work anywhere else, and of course these are the years leading up to the Great Depression. So it would have been very hard for somebody like that to secure work. In the end, he was pretty much just being the caretaker for his wife's nursing home. She was effectively running the nursing home by herself, as well as raising Betty, who was coming up to being 8 or 9, as well as having to look after Charles and his well-being. She was pretty much on edge.
On the morning of January 5th, 1932, all this pressure seemingly caught up with Elspeth. She collapsed in the dining room and had to be taken across the harbour to be treated at Auckland Hospital. The suspicion was she was suffering from a combination of exhaustion and a nasty stomach bug which was going around Devonport at the time. Later, detectives would find another explanation for this sudden collapse, but we'll talk more about that in a moment.
At this time, Charles' mental condition was pretty bad, and a lot of people were very worried about him. So while Elspeth was in hospital I think she was in hospital for 5 days, she had some friends with nursing experience come in to look after the people in the nursing home. But they found that Charles was probably the biggest hurdle. They had to constantly look after him. He would spend his time looking out over the harbour. He was fretting that Elspeth wouldn't come back alive and he was waiting for the next boat to come and bring her body. He just wasn't coping, to the point that one of the nursing students who was helping out wrote a note to send to another one of the family friends to say, hey, could you come around and reassure Charles that Elspeth's fine.
Elspeth returned home after 5 days in hospital, presumably much to the relief of Charles. But that relief was short-lived.
The next day, Charles fell sick and fell into a coma and didn't come out of it. He passed away within a couple of days of her coming out of hospital. It did come as a surprise to a lot of people because, yes, he was mentally unwell, but physically he was fine. He was in his mid-40s. No one thought that he was sick. Elspeth rang Dr. Wheeler, who was the elderly Navy doctor that often came around whenever Elspeth needed a doctor, to come in and tend to one of her patients. He came in and sort of very quickly diagnosed that he died of a brain hemorrhage. So he signed the death off that afternoon. No post-mortem or autopsy or anything like that. And he's buried 2 days later.
The shock of Charles Kerr's unexpected death had barely worn off before there was news of another serious illness in the Kerr household. This time, it was 9-year-old Betty.
Betty fell ill quite quickly, not long after her foster father had died. Elspeth said that she'd gone swimming on the Saturday, and then on the Sunday she went to Sunday school and deteriorated quite rapidly and was admitted to hospital in a near coma. When she came into hospital, the doctors really didn't know what was wrong with her.
When Betty first got sick, Elspeth called in Dr. Wheeler, the retired Navy physician. Dr. Wheeler diagnosed appendicitis, and the doctors at the hospital ran with that theory as well. But there was one who disagreed. 25-year-old Dr. John Stallworthy. Something was bothering him. She clearly had a sore stomach, but her other symptoms didn't quite match with appendicitis. So he went over his superiors' heads to order a battery of tests. And when these tests came back, they showed that Betty didn't have appendicitis. This 25-year-old then went over his superiors' heads a second time, lodging a written protest to the medical superintendent of the hospital, stopping the surgery just as it was about to get underway. Honestly, a pretty brave move from such a junior doctor, although it probably helped that his dad just happened to be the Minister of Health. Anyway, the doctors had now established Betty didn't have appendicitis, but they didn't know what she did have. Dr. Stallworthy wondered if her condition might actually be from a very severe urinary tract infection, something he'd seen his own daughter suffer from.
But while they were deliberating, Betty came right. Within 24 hours, from going from being in almost a coma to being up and about and in cheery spirits and no sign of any illness whatsoever.
The doctors were confused but relieved. They wanted to keep Betty in hospital to do more tests, but Elspeth insisted her foster daughter should come home as soon as possible. She was a nurse after all, more than qualified to look after a sick 9-year-old. The doctors agreed to discharge Betty and gave Elspeth a medication intended to treat her suspected UTI. But then, just 2 days later, the symptoms came back. Doctors arrived at the nursing home to find Betty drifting in and out of consciousness, and again clearly suffering severe pain in her stomach. Elspeth was distraught, but insisted she could care for Betty at home, so long as the doctors gave her the right medicine. The doctors agreed they could wait one more night. But the next morning, things were even worse. Betty's skin was turning blue, her pupils were dilated, and she was convulsing. Elspeth again tried to insist that Betty could be treated at home, but the senior doctor raised his voice. He said that if this 9-year-old didn't get to hospital immediately, she'd be dead within a day. Elspeth collapsed into a chair, sobbing, and Betty was rushed to Auckland Hospital. This time, she was examined by a series of senior medical experts, but her condition had them all stumped. The most confusing thing was that the drug Betty had been given to treat her suspected UTI should have made her urine alkaline, but tests showed it was actually strongly acidic. One doctor raised the possibility of veronal poisoning, a sleeping drug Betty had been prescribed after her first admission. This seemed like a long shot though. Betty had only been given a very small dose, half a tablet. Just to be safe, they pumped her stomach and sent a urine sample to a government lab for testing, but they knew it would take weeks to get a result. All they could do in the meantime was wait. Betty stayed in a coma for 2 full days. But then, for a second time, she staged an astonishing recovery. A girl who'd seemed on the brink of death simply sat up in her bed, started chatting and clapping and singing songs like nothing had been wrong in the first place. Elspeth didn't see Betty in hospital for 2 days. She didn't visit until the afternoon of Saturday, April 16th. Hospital records noted she arrived at 3:15 p.m. and left 20 minutes later. A nurse noticed her stroking her foster daughter's hair and giving her a lolly. About 40 minutes later, the hospital got a worried phone call from Elspeth. She said Betty had seemed unusually sleepy when she'd visited. She didn't think there'd been much improvement in her condition at all. When Dr. John Stallworthy went to check, Betty was once again in a coma. And once again, there was no natural explanation for her condition. Dr. Stallworthy set his jaw and gave the ward's nurse a strict instruction. Betty's room was to be sealed off. No friends or family would be allowed to visit. This 25-year-old doctor had reached a conclusion that nobody else seemed to have seriously considered up to this point. That 9-year-old Betty Kerr was being deliberately poisoned. More senior doctors arrived to examine Betty and, reluctantly, they agreed. The only possible explanation for her condition was poison. The most likely suspect was her foster mother, Elspeth Kerr. But this raised more questions than answers. Nurse Kerr was loved by the local community. No one could imagine her being a poisoner. No one could imagine her trying to kill anybody, let alone a 9-year-old girl. In our next episode, we'll see how police investigated the poisoning of Betty Kerr, and how that investigation turned a single suspicious poisoning into something even more sinister.
You know, she's poisoned 3 people, and I tend to think that, you know, she's deliberately done it. She's, you know, a cold-hearted killer.
Like a serial killer.
Yeah.
And if you want to hear that final part of our story and more grim tales from New Zealand history, make sure you're following Black Sheep wherever you get your podcasts. Black Sheep is written and produced by me, William Ray. This episode was engineered by the Michelangelo of Sound, William Saunders. Organisation came from the General Montgomery of production coordinators, Brianna Uritich-Gregg, and editorial leadership by the Genghis Khan of executive producers, Tim Watkin. I think I can get away with saying that. Sorry, Tim.